Party people, Tony Rowe here. I would like to start off this video with a quote. My chess idol, Bent Larsen, Danish Grandmaster, passed away in 2010, once wrote on Alekhine's defense that many believe that the Alekhine defense is not a good opening. It may be so, but if White is convinced that this is the case, then I'd like him to prove it. And that might be possible. That might be possible in 2021 or 2022, but for now, I'm willing to still uphold the hold the torch for this opening. Let's put it that way. And there's actually a lot to be said for Alekhine's defense. First of all, on a practical level, let's just talk about how well this opening scores relative to what people think about it. So, at least according to the Lichess database, I mean, you guys won't be able to see this, but Alekhine's defense is the 8th most popular, but has the best win percentage. So 49% wins for black, as opposed to 47, 45. That's about as high as they get, as 47. And actually, just in terms of my results, I took a look at my personal opening explorer on Lichess. You can do that now if you didn't know that. And I score 60% in Alekhine's defense, as compared to 55% in the French and 60% in the Sicilian. And don't forget, not to shameless plug here. In 2014 or 2015, I wrote a 464-page monograph on the Kalashnikov Sicilian and spent 4 years of my life doing it. And I scored just as well, if not better, in Alekhine's defense than the Sicilian. You know why? Well, first of all, the positions are complicated. They reward preparation, and also it's the 8th most popular response to e4. How many of you guys that play e4 have a really great repertoire against the Alekhine's defense? I rest my case. And it is relatively respectable. There have been a ton of grandmasters who either specialized in it, like Alexander Baburin, Bagirov, Kangas, another Latvian, Alexander Shabalov's played it a lot. Tons of people from the hyper-modern generation, Reddy, Tartakower, Salo Floor. From the 50s and 60s, guys like Bent Larsen, my dude, Vlastimil Hort, Jan Timman, and more recently, guys like Hikaru Nakamura, Vasily Ivanchuk, Gatakomsky, and Magnus Carlsen himself. Tony Miles, don't forget. So there's a lot to be said for it. And for those of you who aren't familiar with what the Alekhine's defense is, maybe I should put the moves on the board after like 5 minutes into the video. After e4, black goes knight f6, and immediately developing a piece, attacking the e-pawn, but also inviting it forward with e5. And after knight d5, white typically goes d4. And this kind of sets the stage after d6. I think we should talk a little bit about just like, why would you do this? which is not, it's not as obvious why you would do this relative, like e4, e5. That's easy to understand, right? You're playing symmetrically, you're grabbing space in the center, you're developing, you're preparing to develop your king side. Understandable. Why would you allow white to put his pawns in the center and grab a bunch of space with time? And I think there's really like kind of 3 motivations behind it. Structural motivations, let's put it that way. The first is that, of course, just like military expansion, right? If you push too far and you use too much of your time and energy going forward, it's hard to go backwards. And in chess, pawns don't go backwards, and so they can be weak, they can be hard to defend, and they can leave a bunch of squares behind those pawns that are hard to defend because pawns can no longer defend them. That would be the first thing. The second thing would be that on some level, in some spots, fixing a weakness on e5, or sometimes, let's say, after e takes d6, c takes d6, black can occasionally go d5 after that and fix a weakness on d4. Fixing a weakness on a square that's hard to defend and then just attacking that pawn over and over again, sort of Nimzovician blockade and destroy style tactics, are also possible in the Alekhine's defense, right? And I can show you guys a little bit about what I mean. And then the third, and maybe the hardest to understand, would be something like, after just very simple, let's just consider the exchange variation, okay, with c4, knight b6, E takes d6, c takes d6. Straight out of the gate, this central tension between e5 and d6 has given white the option of releasing that tension. And in releasing that tension, white has given black an extra central pawn. So white's essentially exchanged his e-pawn for black's c-pawn. And we get this structure where later black may go e5, and after d takes e5, d takes e5, black is the only one with a pawn in the center. And it can get even more severe, like for instance, after like, let's say e5, d takes e5, d takes e5, f5, black can be the only one who can really dominate in the center. And that advantage can carry through deep into the game, all the way into the end game. The most famous examples of this powerful central pawn mass with an extra e-pawn would be like Yates' Alekhine, I think. And there's actually a really beautiful Vladimir Malakov game that has the same sort of theme. These deep endings where having the central pawn mass is more valuable than having an extra c-pawn, essentially. And I will post those games in the study as well. So yeah, and just to give you guys examples, like, okay, there's like of overextension. Probably the easiest place to find these would be in the 4 pawns attack, where white spends the maximum amount of time and grabs the maximum amount of space. There's a somewhat risky variation that goes like so, where black pushes c5 very early to try and leave this pawn kind of undefendable and weak. And so after bishop g7, you can kind of see what's going on here. Bishop f4, castles, and now instead of the sort of compulsory queen d2, bishop e2 is okay too. White goes very natural but dubious knight f3, which allows bishop g4. This is the downside. Again, it becomes hard to defend the pawn. h3, bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, knight d7, attacking this pawn again. Queen e3, defending the pawn, and now black plays a very strong queen to b8. Attacking the pawn for a third time when white can no longer defend it, and white's next move is sort of compulsory. And it looks kind of good at first, right? Like you're forcing, because of this discovered attack and this attack on the knight, you're forcing black's knight to hop into this pin, but because of the threat of knight e takes c4 hitting the queen, getting out of the pin, and also a much trickier threat of f takes e6, d takes e6, rook takes f4, queen takes f4, knight d3 check with a fork on the queen and also a discovered attack on the queen. So fancy. White actually is kind of in trouble here a little bit. The game, this is Panarin Palachek, 2005. The game continued e takes f7, rook takes f7, which is probably a mistake. Not rook takes f7, e takes f7. Again, renewing this threat. White goes bishop h2, and then black gets to take on c4 when you can kind of see another one of these pawns fall. And the problem usually is when one falls, they all fall. Like now d5 is weak. Black is munching on all these things. And after queen takes c5, again, black has to deal with this threat and this threat. In the game, Palachek played queen c8, the most pragmatic move, but also very fancy knight takes b2 as possible. Again, with this fork. For maybe more subtle examples of, like, let's say, fixing weaknesses, we could go to the classical variation with bishop g4. And again, white could go into these structures with the extra e-pawn at any time if he wants, but if he tries to keep it, this is called the floor variation with c6, named after Salo floor. And what the main idea of this variation is to try and fix this weak pawn on e5 with bishop f3, e6. So black exchanges off the light square bishop, gives up the 2 bishops, but then puts all his pawns on light squares, which makes this bishop very good, very solid structure, and he's hoping to prove that this e-pawn is weak in the long term. And in this game, this is Kaidanov Ivanchuk in 1987, so no slouches either. This is high-level chess. Kaidanov went c4, couldn't resist, and black plays a very strong knight e7. The best square, because after knight g6, the e-pawn starts looking real weak. And I've drawn these arrows, of course. There's knight g6, there's knight d7, and there's also the less obvious transfer of the bishop to the c7 square to start to gang up on this white e-pawn. And white has scored terror. There have been tons of games in the database in this position. White has scored absolutely horrendously. For another maybe less obvious example of fixing a weakness at the base of the pawn chain, there's a variation in the exchange. Voronezh. And again, knight f3, not best, but instructive. You can see white kind of, black just kind of develops around the pressure along the long diagonal and the pressure on the d-pawn. So like if white were to try and offload the pressure on the d4 pawn by playing this, then of course this bishop becomes a monster. That's the main issue here. And there's also the threat of bishop takes f3, bishop takes f3, knight takes c4. That's a problem, so white goes b3. And black goes d5 this time, instead of e5. And after c5, knight to c8, looks awkward at first, but again, we're fixing this pawn on this square where, again, it can't be defended by any other pawns. And very simply, like, for instance, h3 was played in a game Eigner-Nakamura, North American Open in 2007. After bishop takes f3, bishop takes f3, e6, black has a very easy plan of knight e7, knight f5, attacking this thing over and over again, queen f6 if required. Easy play. So that's kind of the flavor of Aлекhine's defenses. You know, you're either luring these pawns forward, you're fixing a weakness, or you're trying to build up enough tension against the e-pawn such that white has to exchange it off and give you an extra pawn in the center, give you that extra e-pawn structure, so to speak. And I've included some sort of famous games. Okay, there, you know, the Alechine's defense. It's funny. Maybe I should have mentioned this in the intro. There's like all kinds of like funny lore that surrounds the Alechine's defense about like how some of these like legends picked it up. Like for instance, probably a lot of you guys know about Bobby Fischer's use of Alechine's defense in the 1972 World Championship in Reykjavik against Spassky. There were two games, and the first game, I think it was game 13, Fischer won an absolutely beautiful game in Alechine's defense. Like, induced this weakness on a4, and then he won the a4 pawn, and then this ending was absolutely bonkers with crazy pawns versus pieces, and yeah, real grind. I'll link to that game as well, of course. But Fischer also played it 7 years earlier in Havana, and I think like a telegram game. And this was his first outing with Alechine's defense, and it's rumored to be a mistake. In like the relay of the moves to Fischer, he thought his opponent played d4 and he responded knight f6, and then obviously was very confused when white played his second move as 2e5, which would obviously be impossible after d4. So this story is unconfirmed, but also not proven false. Miles also played Alechine's defense in 3 games in the Capablanca Memorial, I think in, don't hold me to this, but maybe like the 90s, like 93, 94, somewhere around there. Just because he thought it would be funny to win the Capablanca Memorial with Alechine's defense. Another funny, you know, sort of chess history joke. And perhaps the most famous, interesting story about Alechine's defense is Bagirov, who's a Latvian. I think he's passed away now, but don't hold me to that. Has maybe played Alechine's defense more than anyone. Maybe an exception is like Baburin, but Bagirov's up there, like hundreds and hundreds of games with Alechine's defense. And he claims that Alekhine came to him in a dream and told him that he must play Alechine's defense as like his main weapon. And so he did. I mean, it's like he just did. But anyway, yeah, interesting like sort of vibes surrounding Alechine's defense. And okay, so that's kind of like the motivation behind Alechine's defense. Let's talk a little bit about like concrete theory, just to get nothing in depth. I just want to give like some quick variations, kind of paint the landscape, give you guys a flavor of like what's possible after e4, knight f6. So let's talk first about the exchange variation. Yeah, why would I start at the starting? Okay, so after e4, knight f6, bouncing the horsey. E5, knight d5, d4, d6. White can either take here immediately or go c4 first. I think c4 first is most common. And then just offload the pawn. And yeah, so I first of all, I don't want to make it seem like a necessarily like an obvious concession that White's trading the e pawn for the c pawn, because yes, Black has an extra pawn, but it's not like he's winning yet or anything. I think White is probably still overall like a tiny bit better in these structures. He has this broad sort of extra space in the center with this d pawn c pawn combo, but Black's plan generally is to use either the break d5 or e5 to equalize that central space. And usually if e5, White will react with d takes e, and then like c5 or d5, of course, which would reach kind of like an odd, kind of like almost like pseudo King's Indian kind of structure. And if d5, then White will usually go c5 and gain that space on the queen side and look to expand with like b4, b5, for instance. And we'll see that a little bit in the variations. And by the way, it's also possible to go e takes d6. I am just so unenthusiastic about this move. Like, first of all, I think White is still slightly better here, but also like if you wanted a symmetrical structure, like, okay, Black's really only plan here is to like usually go like bishop e7, castles, knight c6, and then you're hoping to go like bishop g4, lop off a knight, build up pressure against this d4 pawn, excuse me, and like possibly go d5. But honestly, if you wanted like a symmetrical structure where the e pawns are gone and it's like d4, d5, and c4 are included, just play the Petrov. Like, you know, why would you play Alekhine's defense and like try and induce e takes d6 and then not play for the central majority? That's my opinion. Okay, there's like a game or two quoted in the notes. You can check out e takes d6 if you want. There's coverage in a ton of Alekhine books. So I've got my stack here just so you guys can see like what I'm working with here. That these are like all of the Alekhine's books that I have. I actually have a Baggerov like monograph that's like super old, but I can't find it. I have like hundreds and hundreds, probably like 700 chess books. I lost it. I'll find it. But yeah, the e takes d6 is covered in some of those. If you want to, if you get really into it, you can look in those. I'm not going to talk about it that much. Okay, so almost exclusively played. Well, this move is played the most. Let's put it that way. Knight c3. Other moves like knight f3 or bishop e2, bishop d3 are all possible. Bishop e3, they're all generally going to transpose to something that has knight c3 in it. The moves here are kind of interchangeable because Black and White have like pretty limited contact. It is possible to go d5 here, which is kind of cute. The point being is that Black wants to go g6, but now that kind of runs into queen d4. But it's funny, like rook g8 and bishop g7 is still a very playable line here for Black, first of all. But there's also this very cute idea that goes like this. And then Black is just going to very quickly develop and try and exploit the fact that White's queen is in the center. I think this is actually a very good retort. But okay, knight c3. Black pretty much always goes for this long diagonal development with g6. And the main setup here is called the Voronezh. And I believe that's like a region in Russia. And I think it's named after like some Russian correspondence players from the Voronezh, like, I don't know what you'd call it, district, who like popularized this system. But the idea is that, well, I'll show you the moves first. It goes bishop e3, bishop g7, rook c1, castles, and then b3, which looks kind of odd. But I think the logic of the variation can kind of be seen if Black plays the most obvious move, knight c6. And in this case, White responds d5. I'm going to annotate that exclam because I forgot. Gaining space in the center, and you can kind of already see some of the points. The first point is that the long diagonal is completely vacated now. White has played b3, rook c1, gotten the hell out of dodge, really, and now after knight e5, there's a second problem for black, in that it's running out of squares. If white had played knight f3 earlier, then black would be able to just get rid of this thing and wouldn't have any problems. But in this position, after bishop e2, there's actually a really serious threat of f4 trapping the knight, which would be an issue. Usually black plays f5 to give yourself this really sad f7 square, but after f4, knight f7 is possible, knight g4 is also possible, bishop g4, f g4, knight e2. White is just like tremendously better and scores like 70% or, you know, higher in the database in these positions. It's very bad for black. A second point of these variations is that if white goes nf3 like anytime early, black can go bishop g4 and offload this problem piece and start building up pressure against the pawn. And you might be wondering, like, okay, why b3? Like, why not, let's say, bishop e2 here, which is a more useful developing move than b3. Also does not put a knight on f3, so you can't pin it. Also does not give black any way to offload the piece after d5, knight e5. Now in this case, d5 can be met by c5, knight c4, which is very annoying. For instance, if I'm hitting b2, I'm hitting this bishop, that's annoying. If bishop takes c4, d takes c4, black opens up sometimes the d5 square for the queen, but extra pressure against the d pawn, and also this annoying idea of bishop f5 to d3. And so it turns out that also this c4 square, excuse me, is kind of like a little bit loose. And so it's worth shoring up this square. Now d5, c5 would be a disaster for black. So it's really, this system really does like three things kind of like low key and weird. It stops bishop g4. After knight c6, it allows d5 because nothing is on the long diagonal. And also after knight e5, there is no knight f3. And it stops d5, knight c4, which is another active plan for black. So it's actually really sort of difficult in a way to deal with this. And for a long time, this was thought to be like the refutation of c takes d6 in the exchange Alekhine. And then it turned out that probably not one, but two moves are very reasonable here. There's 9 bishop f5, which basically looks to just be like sort of an in-between waiting move while forcing white to find some other move. Like, you know, white generally actually does go knight f3 or bishop e2 here because it's just hard to play any other move. Without the knight on c6, d5 makes less sense because now this knight can come to d7. And like a lot of games continue... Well, first of all, let's illustrate like what would happen if white was kind of a dum-dum. So like if we go g6 and white just continues like nf3, real lazy like, bishop g7, let's go bishop e3 now, bishop g4, bishop e2, castles, let's say, and knight c6. And now, so like black doesn't really have the threat of bishop takes f3, knight c4 yet because there's bishop takes b7, but after knight c6, now white needs to do something about this. Of course, he could take with the g-pawn, but that would be very sad. So usually people go b3 here. And then we get kind of positions similar to the Eigner-Nakamura game that we talked about after d5. First of all, white is reluctant to take here. Even knight b4. Taking here is fine, but even knight b4 and then knight takes d5 leaves black with a pretty good position fighting against an isolated pawn. So c5, knight c8, and then we get this same structure we get before, okay? Where... you know, bishop f3, e6, knight d7, knight f5. I've won so many games on lead chess with this plan. It's ridiculous. Okay, so similar position after bishop f5. Most games continue knight f3, and then black goes bishop g4 and just plays the original variation is so good for black that black can just play it basically a tempo down. And like most games go like... bishop e2, d5, c5, knight to c8, castles, and then like knight c6, h3, for instance, takes, hitting the d-pawn, e6, protecting the d-pawn, and then again, yeah, we get this same plan here. Black's a tempo down, but these positions are still very very playable for black. Okay, so that's kind of like one option against this Voronezh. There is kind of a hitch with this move. First of all, there's like bishop e2, which is fine. You can kind of like do the same thing, and if white goes knight f3, you just go bishop g4, and you kind of just invert the move order. But there are other moves here, like bishop f3. I think black kind of has to go with this pawn sacrifice with e5. It gives black pretty great counterplay, but it's complicated. And then there's the move recommended, I think, by Krzysztof Alekhine, is keep it simple e4. G4, not keeping it simple, but G4 keeping it strong. Let's put it that way. And this move is challenging. It is hard. I do think that bishop d7 is playable for black. It involves a piece sacrifice. Let's see if I can remember the line. Bishop d7. I didn't really plan on covering this, but here we are. Bishop g2, hitting b7. Knight c6. Yeah, looking for d5. So white goes d5. Yes, this is it. Knight e5, hitting g4, h3, and then f5, f4, I think. When black can go knight e takes c4, b takes c4, knight takes c4, bishop d4, and then it starts getting weird after knight to b2. And these variations are not easy to explain or not easy to understand. For instance, like queen d2, bishop d4, and I think the move is queen b6 here. And yeah, it's complicated because after this, black is threatening basically to play knight d3 check, but there's also just g4s hanging. And it's just hard for white to really prosecute these positions because he has very few pawns left and they're all very weak. Like after f takes g4, h takes g4, f4 is hanging, g4 is hanging, a2 is very weak because it's on a long an open file. So it's just hard for white to win these positions because he sort of runs out of pawns. But yeah, it requires a lot of theoretical knowledge to sort of like, you know, get to these positions and also probably survive these positions realistically. But yeah, so that this is an interesting option. There's also the more straightforward option of pursuing like the central majority plan. And this has been played in like tons and tons of correspondence games. So e5, d takes e5, d takes e5, c5, like I talked about in the intro. Oh, excuse me, queen d8, rook d8, c5. And then knight c to d7. And there are different options here. Knight f3, bishop c4. Just one variation, for example. These lines are kind of complicated. Bishop c4, knight c6, knight f3. Pretty standard development. Black goes h6 to not allow like shenanigans with this. Maybe even bishop g5. It's just a good square to have covered. Gives black the h7 square. Knight e4, looking to hop into this juicy outpost. Knight a5. Getting this bishop off this annoying diagonal so that black can activate this central majority with f5. And indeed, after bishop e2, f5, knight d6, knight c6. Quite a few games have reached this position. I think like maybe 10 in my database or so, and they're pretty much all drawn. They're pretty much all correspondence games. But I think black is generally doing fine here as well. But that's the sort of exchange variation in a nutshell. How are we doing on time here? Half an hour. Okay. So let's talk about the 4 pawns attack next. I think this might honestly be the closest to a refutation of the Alekhine's defense as it gets. So e4, knight f6, d4, d6, c4, knight b6, f4, and yeah, there is this. That's hilarious. Why did I highlight this? There is this wild try with g5 here, but I don't know why g5 was highlighted. There are really 2 kind of strategies here. The first one is to go d takes e5, f takes e5, knight to c6. Of course, d5 is not possible because the e pawn is weak. And after bishop e3, knight f3, as usual in the Alekhine's defense, should possibly be delayed because of bishop g4. So white goes bishop e3. And after bishop f5, knight c3, e6, knight to e3, knight to f3, excuse me. There are tons of moves here. Yeah, I think bishop b4, queen d7, and bishop g4, these are sort of the second-rate moves. None of them are good, as far as I can tell. They're very risky, and against good, accurate play from white, I think black is just quite a bit worse in these variations. Now, The main move is just sort of classical development with bishop e7. And there are two moves here for white. There's bishop e2, which I would say is sort of like the strangulation approach. And really, there's like two kind of approaches to white in the Alekhine's defense. One is just to grab like a small nagging edge, and the other is just to try to smack black over the head with gaining lots of space, trying to blow back black off the board. And this is kind of representative of those two options. There's bishop e2, which would be like the slow strangulation option, where probably white is going to exchange off this e-pawn after f6 and just try and sit on black with this d4, c4 constellation. And then there's d5 instead, which is like, I'm going to rip your face off. And that line continues ed, cd, knight b4, threatening knight c2, nasty. Knight d4, hitting the bishop and also guarding against knight c2 check. And black must go bishop d7 here. If bishop g6, which is slightly more natural, this move is an absolute blowout. Forcing king f8, which is just disgusting. And I think like king f8 castles, black is starting knight e6 check, winning a queen, for instance. It's not good. Yeah, so after d5, ed, cd, knight b4, knight d4, bishop d7, white goes all in, e6, f takes e6, d takes e6, bishop c6. And now there's queen g4, hitting here. And black goes bishop h4 check. Exploiting the missing f-pawn, really. And white can afford to go g3, bishop takes h1, and now either castles long or g takes h4. I think g takes h4 is the main move. This is a hot mess. Like all of this variation, you could dig into these variations for a day, you know, castles, a week. Castles or g takes h4. This is a mess, but as far as I know, black is holding their own there. I've never had anyone go this far with me into the theory, so my knowledge here is somewhat lacking, but the other option is to just go bishop e2, which honestly I think is better. And after castles, most games have continued f6. Black needs to chip away at the center. He can't just sit around forever. Bishop takes f6, queen d2, simple development. Queen e7. Rook, whoop, how did that happen? Rook a to d1, rook a to d8, putting the rook on the open file, threatening perhaps something like knight d4, bishop d4, bishop d4, e5, for instance, is possible. It's starting to become clear that black is going to try and use this pin along the d file on this weak d4 pawn. And most people have gone queen c1. I think queen c1 is not correct, though. I've had... I'm proud to say that when this move was in my notes, it was a novelty. This move, 15 e5, I think is just acceptable for black. The idea is that after d5, black can sack a pawn with knight d4. And after, let's see, how does this go? Bishop d4, e4, knight d4 allows bishop g5, which is awkward. And I think the only move here is queen a1. Knight takes f5 is a mistake because of queen c5 check when I'm hitting your queen and king at the same time. And you can't deal with them both. Not to be recommended. I'll mark that in my notes here. Double question mark. Yeah, so white must go bishop g5 to queen a1, and then I think black has relatively good counterplay here after like bishop e3 check, king h1, bishop d4, rook d4, and then there's this funny move knight a4, trying to deflect the knight away from the defense of this bishop. And this has now been played in 2019, but I was there first. I can't prove that, but I was there first. Okay, so there are other moves, though, like, for instance, instead of queen c1 here, I think king h1 is taking over as a pretty good move. There are variations where it's useful, first of all, that the king is not on the long diagonal, but also that the bishop can slip back to e1. And unfortunately for black, like, at least I have not been able to find a variation, an idea yet that sort of busts out. Of course, like, if you look at this position, if black does nothing, he's structurally worse and he has less space, right? He's got the weak e6 pawn. This is sort of unpleasant, and white has this kind of unpleasant central majority. And if we don't find some way to go e5 or generate some counterplay somehow against, let's say, a weakness on c4 or d4, you're just going to suffer long term, I think. And yeah, this was played in Robson Naroditsky from U.S. Championships 2021, and Daniel Naroditsky lost a pretty horrifying game. It's just a tough position, and Ray Robson generally just squeezed him to death and then just blew him away. So worth looking into this if your life is the Alekhine's defense. There are other options, like besides d takes e5, but I'm genuinely not a believer in them either. The main idea is g6, and after knight c3, bishop g7, bishop e3, again delaying knight f3 as long as possible. There's really two ideas. Castles appears to be pretty much refuted, sadly. It's already refuted after c5. And after knight 6 to d7, I think h4 is just very strong. And unfortunately for black, like, this center is actually too well bolstered to really open up lines in time, and h5 comes, knight f3, queen c2, maybe bishop d3, and it's likely that white will crash through on the king side before black figures out a way to organize his pieces. Less space, white center's too solid. Not easy to play. So after 5g6, knight c3, bishop g7, bishop e3, black players started playing this funny move, bishop e6, the so-called Sergeyev variation. And the idea is actually that after like d5, which is an obvious move, first of all, you're not really threatening anything yet, as far as I know, because taking here 2 times would lose the queen a4 check. But after castles, you will be. So, like, there are some interesting ideas here. After d5, the idea actually is you just go back with bishop c8, and you're just claiming that now that the pawn is not on d4 and it's on d5 and it can't go backwards, that e5 is sort of weak. And of course, like castles, bishop g4, knight to d7, all this sort of thematic crap that you would play in Alekhine's defense. c6 is possible, f6 is possible, perhaps. Black will get good counterplay. There's also a very cheeky trap if, like, bishop e6, b3, castles, knight f3. Black can also go c5, I believe. And after d takes c5, black can go knight 6 to d7, with the idea that c takes d6, e takes d6. Of course not e takes d6, bishop takes c3, destroying you on the long diagonal. Queen d6 can be met by knight takes e5. When, for instance, queen d8, of course, allows knight takes f3 check, g takes f3, rook d8, and c3 would be hanging. That would be very good for black, who's shattered white's pawn structure and has enormously active pieces. But f takes e5, of course, queen takes d6, repins the e-pawn, and after e to ed, there's bishop c3. So black has pretty good counterplay here in this case. I think white is actually forced to do this, and then you take here. So that's kind of the idea. Unfortunately, I think the refutation of this line is like very similar to the Voronezh, where white just removes everything from the long diagonal. So like something like rook c1, castles, b3. There are 4 games in the Lichess database. White wins 3 of them and draws 1. I think I've analyzed this variation more extensively than almost anything else in chess, maybe some Kalashnikov positions. And I just can't find anything for black here. I think essentially black just has less space, but worth considering. It just takes one move. You know, maybe I'll boot up Leela 0 one day and it'll find something in the 4 pawns attack somewhere that will be less discouraging for black than what's currently out there now. And then, you know, I'll be back to being like, man, maybe I should write a book on Alekhine's defense. But for now, I just play it in blitz games and just have fun with it, you know? Okay, so the last variation is, for what it's worth, I've never had anyone play like super challenging lines in the Alekhines almost anywhere. Okay, people are just, again, it's the 8th most popular move. People are generally just not that well prepared. So again, still worth considering if you're into just like practical weapons. Okay, the classical variation. So this is the variation where white goes d4, d6, and then just knight f3. And again, this is more of a system where white would be going for a small nagging edge. It's probable at some point that white will play e takes d6 and c4. but not guaranteed. And black sort of has two strategies here. One is to drag the knight to e5 with d takes e5, knight takes e5. And it might seem weird because you're sort of losing time in a way. You're giving white knight to e5 for free. But also, in most positions in chess, when you have less space, your idea is usually to exchange minor pieces. And Alekhine's defense specifically is so much more comfortable for black if you can lop off like one or two sets of minor pieces. And so black intends to gain back the time by going knight d7 at some point, attacking this knight that you've forced to the e5 square, if that makes sense. And of course, again, those of you who are maybe more familiar with chess history will know that this variation is perhaps the most famous game in this is Tal Larsen, sometime in the 60s, maybe 65. And attacking the knight right away with knight d7 is frowned upon because of knight takes f7. King takes f7, queen h5 with a double attack on these things. If you want to save the piece, you have to go king e6, but then after c4, knight f6, d5 check. Black is forced to take a further walk, and then after queen f7, there's a very serious threat to take a very long walk with queen e6, but knight e5 guards that square. Bishop f4 with the pin. c5, giving black the c7 square and also possibly preventing a move like c5. Knight c3, looking to hop in. a6, stopping said hop. And then b4 is the supposed reputation. I'm not going to go further than this. Let's be honest, who would ever play this position anyway? A more modern variation of this is c6, the so-called Miles variation, named after Tony Miles. And this is like sort of the new hotness in the Alekhine's defense. I use new very loosely here. I think it's been popular for like 10 years, but theory isn't moving at light speed in these variations. But yeah, the idea is sort of obvious. It's basically to go knight d7 at some point without allowing knight to f7. You're just bolstering this knight on this square. It's also useful sometimes to be able to go to the c7 square in the event of like c4, for instance. Most games continue bishop e2, bishop f5. So before you go knight d7, it usually helps to get the light square bishop out. Castles, knight d7, and white avoids the trade with knight f3. This is the most popular move anyway. And after e6, we get a position that kind of looks like the Scandinavian defense, and I would say it's evaluated similar to the Scandinavian defense. After c4, knight 5 to f6. White has a bunch of moves here. There's knight h4 immediately. There's knight c3. Knight h4 allows possibly bishop takes f1, or bishop takes b1, excuse me. Or just bishop f4, stopping queen c7 and bishop d6. I think this might be the best move, or it's the most annoying move anyway. Black or white can go knight h4 like the next move, but it seems to me like going bishop f4 prophylactically first is annoying. I tend to think that in general, white is just slightly better in these positions. Again, it looks like a Scandi. You're playing d4, c4 against e6, c6. Long term, black is going to look to develop really solidly with bishop d6 or bishop e7. Castles, queen c7, bring those rooks to the central files, and then break out with just like sort of very straightforward equality with e5 or c5. Chipping away at that pawn center. That's sort of the idea anyway behind this variation. There's also the Kangas, which is similar, except black elects instead to put the bishop on g7. And most games continue something like bishop c4, simple development, c6, bolstering the knight against stuff like queen to f3, bishop g7, rook e1, castles, bishop b3, threatening something like this, for instance, getting ready to anyway. Bishop e6, and yeah, again, black has this sort of, this move is kind of odd in a way, like it looks sort of like, why wouldn't you put it on f5? But black, again, is looking to go knight d7, threatening to exchange the knight, and possibly knight c7, threatening to exchange off the bishop. And again, long-term, really, black would be much more comfortable if he was trading off minor pieces, and also, again, is going to look for e5 or c5 in these positions. In the Kangas, sometimes there's also this other idea of like gaining lots of space on the queen side, b5, a5, a4, a3. And there's this interesting strategic concept a lot of times that black would like to insert a5, a4, for instance. because then after c4, the b4 square would be a very strong outpost for black's knight. Whereas if you just go, like, for instance, like, let's say queen d6, I'm not saying in this position specifically, but c4, knight b4 then would be much less palatable because a3 is still possible. I've included some extra variations in the notes and stuff related to all of these, but I'm just kind of giving you guys a quick zip through some of the classical variations. Those are the main ones after d takes e5. Black can also try and leave the tension. Historically, the main line has been bishop g4, but I don't think people are super hot on this lately. Again, simple classical development for white and black, really. c4, knight b6, grabbing more space in the center. Knight c3, castles, bishop e3, and then there's two moves here. Yeah, d5 has been played. I think there's like a nuance here that this move is more promising if white has flicked in h3 and bishop h5, which is sort of odd to think about. Like, why the hell would that make any sense? But I think after something like c5, bishop takes f3, g takes f3, exclam, not allowing knight c4 after this. Knight c8, f4. The g takes f3 and f4 is also just very useful in bolstering the center, and also after king h1, rook g1. There's some scary stuff happening on black's king side. But yeah, with h3 in, I think actually the rook, for instance, not having the h3 square is kind of annoying for white. But yeah, this is a variation where historically black has suffered greatly. So wouldn't recommend that. It's also possible to just go knight c6 here, but it seems like white is doing pretty well with ed, cd, d5. With just slight positional pressure after something like this, black has sort of this stinky d6 pawn. I'm not too excited about this variation specifically. But again, yeah, it just takes like one idea where someone finds something and then black is equal somewhere, and then something completely changes. Falling under the leaving the tension category, there's the move that Fischer played against Spassky with g6, and this could frequently transpose to like the exchange variation, and it often does. For instance, after like c4, knight b6, e takes d6, c takes d6, knight c3, bishop g7, we're back in it, except white has already played the stinky move, knight f3, so we already know that's not very good. More common is after g6, bishop c4, and then we can get kind of like a pseudo Kangas with c6, and indeed after like castles, bishop g7, white frequently goes here, and then this looks very similar to the Kangas, except white's knight is not on the e5 square. I tend to think this is a maybe slightly worse Kangas. It's sort of annoying if white goes like very quick rook e1, castles, bishop g5, for instance, but it might be playable. But yeah, again, more common would be something like this, and then the most critical variation is knight g5, trying to basically beat black up and force some weaknesses before black can properly consolidate. Having forced g6 with black already having forced e6, excuse me, with black already having g6 in, leaves pretty weak dark squares. And indeed, you see like problems starting to crop up with bishop g5 immediately. They're not as severe as it might seem, though. This variation is pretty old. There have been a lot of games that continue d takes e5, bishop g5, queen b4 check, c3, and now queen e5, when bishop f6 is surprisingly enough the main move, and after like takes, castles, queen e5, d takes e5, we get this endgame where black's development is a little slow, and there's obviously knight f6 check coming. There are holes on the dark squares, but bishop d7 to c6, a5, a4, for instance, knight comes to d7 or c6. Maybe this knight comes to d7. And yeah, black, again, has exchanged off a set of minor pieces. His other pieces find reasonable squares. For the most part, it seems like this is pretty much equal. And indeed, Stockfish thinks this is equal, and Practice thinks this is equal. There's also a fairly annoying move here in just instead of bishop g5, the calm d takes e5. Problem is something like this gets beat up pretty bad after this. Black sort of has to go here, and then this is actually a real problem now. Bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6. Like, rook g8 is pretty horrific. For instance, just here, castle's long, and mating you on d8 is a problem. Not to be recommended. I think the best move is h6, but you do allow knight f6 check, king f8, and then Black is probably okay if not for this move, which is pretty annoying. Correspondence chess has seen this variation a lot, actually, and Black is surviving. Like, but yeah, you have to be precise here. This is something that maybe I would play OTB if I was well prepared. Bishop e3 to c5 is a threat. Black has to sort of fix his king on f8. But again, yeah, this e-pawn can't move backwards, and it is possible that it's going to be weak. Yeah, it's an interesting one. Unclear position. There's also a very famous variation in this line after bishop g7 and now a4, threatening to boot this knight again. And Black can go d takes, and White continues again with this plan. And one of the interesting things about this, the knight being forced back to the d7 square, is that it stops the coverage of the e6 square from this bishop. It leaves the light squares like just the tiniest bit weaker and allows this cute combination with bishop takes f7, king takes f7, knight g5, king g8. This move, allowing knight e6 trapping the queen, would be hilarious. Not recommended. Same thing, this is a fork, so king g8 is forced. And then knight e6, king e8, knight c7 with the fork, king d8, and White can force a draw with knight e6 or take this exchange. This tends to be not so clear. I think most Black players are happy to take on d4 and go into this mess, but there is a downside that this variation comes with a forced draw if White wants it. So, and I think that those three variations are the main ones. So classical is really historically the main one, and then you got the exchange and the four pawns attack kind of in second place. Though honestly, I think the four pawns attack is the most critical from my research. There are other lines. I'm coming up on an hour here, which is a very long video, so I'm going to just very briefly outline those. So after e4, knight f6, did I bungle this? No, okay. Whew. A very popular in my games, played in almost a quarter of my games, is knight c3, which is interesting because it allows a direct transposition to the Vienna game, which I think honestly might be Black's best. And knight c3 has been played in like 26% of my games, I calculated. But in the Lichess database, I think people only play the Vienna game here like 7% of the time, which to me implies that there are a bunch of people who go e4, knight f6, to knight c3, and then after e5 go like, oh shit, I don't play the Vienna game. But they don't want to play a mainline Alekhine defense for some reason, and so they just play this, and then they're forced to play something they don't know. It is possible for Black to go to d5 here, and there are some funny transpositions here as well, like e5, knight f d7, of course, if knight d5, knight e5. f4, now this pawn is legitimately hanging. e6, d4, c5, knight f3 is a classical French. It is possible also for Black to go knight e4, but it is considered to be somewhat risky due to this weird move. It's not inconceivable that this thing could be trapped, for instance, like after like h4, d3, d5, or d4, and then f3. There are some weird ways you can try and threaten to trap this knight, but it's also just annoying that this thing is stuck here because you're probably going to get booted again by this d pawn. Yeah, it's also possible that White can enter the King's Indian attack after d3, d5, knight d2, following up with the same old King's Indian attack moves. Against the Alekhine, the King's Indian attack might be the worst, though, because the e pawn and the c pawn still have complete flexibility, whereas like in the French, the bishop is already blocked in, Black is already committed to e6, and in the Caro, Black is already committed to c6. In Alekhine's defense, Black has only played knight f6, which is just very useful anyway. So it's actually possible for Black to gain maximum space and go into like reverse King's Indian positions instead. And indeed, like, these positions actually seem really horrible for white, which is funny because they're King's Indian defense reversed, but white is committed to knight b to d2, for instance, and typically plays c3. And after d4, black has scored absolutely wonderfully. As far as other move 2 options, there's a very cheeky move in 2 bishop c4. It kind of stinks, though. The point is that after knight e4, bishop takes f7, white is getting the knight back because king g8, queen d5 is a double attack. However, after queen takes e4, d5, queen e2, I think white's position kind of sucks. It's possible to go c5 here with just a massive pawn center and then just standard sort of developing stuff. Eventually, black will fix his king, excuse me. Knight c6 here might be the most precise, though. Just looking to go very quickly e5. You have knight d4 possibly on the cards, bishop c5, queen f6, h6, king h7, that kind of thing. White does not have the development or central control to really launch an attack against his king on g8, so it's not very weak at all. And there are some interesting deviations here, too. There's the chase variation with c4, knight b6, c5, knight d5, and white has these sort of 3 moves. Again, trying to gain more time on the knight with bishop c4, knight c3. Natural. Black is usually going to go like d6 and b6 to try and attack these pawns. It's possible after knight c3, though, for black to go like e6, kind of an interesting move, accepting this sort of odd pawn structure with double d pawns. But he'll get rid of one of them soon with d6 anyway. It is also possible for white to go knight c3, forcing some sort of decision again. Black pretty much always takes, and then depending on how white takes, usually black decides on the location of his d-pawn. For instance, against b takes c3, it's kind of interesting to go d5. And after d4, c5, we get a position, a structure anyway, that's very similar to the French win hour, except black has lost some time. But black also has not locked in the light squared bishop yet, and has not given up the dark squared bishop to get these double c-pawns. I tend to think this structure and position is at least practically very dangerous for white. And historically, white has not scored very well here. For instance, after knight f3, which is the main move, by far, played in 75% of the games, white wins 21%, draws 28%, and black wins a whopping 51%. After d takes c3 instead, I'd probably recommend black go d6, and then after knight f3, it's actually even possible for black to go d takes e5 here. And the point is that after queen takes d8, king takes d8, knight takes e5, queen to e8, black reaches an endgame where he's the only one with a pawn majority. Again, we have this extra e-pawn, and because white has played d takes c3, white cannot make a pass pawn on this side of the board, and black can make a pass pawn on his side of the board. So if we literally took everything off, black would be winning, I think. You would just make a passed e-pawn, and then use that passed e-pawn to gobble up all of white's pawns. But interesting. I don't think white's worse here or anything. Like bishop c4, e6 has generally been played, and I would say plays about equal. But this is not required either. Black can also just go knight c6, and after bishop b5, g6 is possible and very good, and bishop d7 is played quite a bit and is also very good. After d4, d6, I think f4 is very likely to transpose to the 4 pawns attack after c4. E takes d6, again, is very likely to transpose to a full-fledged exchange variation after c4 as well. The only real deviation here that I haven't talked about is bishop c4. And after knight b6, bishop b3, white relies... Of course, after d takes e5, white will not go d takes e5, queen takes d1. That would be unfortunate. White relies on this double attack on f7 and e5 to force e6, and then go d takes e5 and gain the pawn back. I don't think this is like super exciting for white. a5, a4, for instance, and then knight a6, looking to go knight c5 and use this bishop as a target on the queen side. It seems fine for black. This is Milosevic Baburin. And of course, if you're into Alekhine's defense, check out Alexander Baburin. Absolute beast. But yeah, I think that actually finishes the coverage. We are coming up on exactly 1 hour. I'm going to call it here. I hope that you guys enjoyed this. This was by far the most requested video in my 3,000 subs video giveaway. So I hope that you guys that requested this video feel vindicated that I finally got around to it. And I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope this quick guide inspires you to take up and score a lot of points with Alekhines. I believe in you guys. Tony Rowe signing off.